Hi, Misha here, and I thought it was time to revisit the aircraft used by the Chinese People's Liberation Army Air Force and People's Liberation Navy Air Force. And I think I'll do this probably in two parts. And in this one, we're going to look at essentially indigenous designs, ones that were more or less created within China. So to that end, on the far left, we have the J-8. This is a fighter interceptor. It was really China's first domestic aircraft design. Then we have the JH7. This was a fighter bomber ground attack aircraft, also maritime patrol attack. Then we have the J10. This was originally to be a fighter to kind of rival the MiG-29 or Sukhoi Su-27, but as it happened, it evolved into more of a multi-role fighter, like, say, the F-16. And then we get to the more modern aircraft that are just now coming into use. We have the J20. And this is the Air Force's newest aircraft. And then finally we have the J31, which, while it was maybe designed for export, seems to be finding favor with the Chinese Navy now that it's beginning to operate aircraft carriers more regularly. So all these models are 1/72 scale diecast from Air Force One. All have gear down with ordnance, metal stands, and pilot figures. A nice little arrangement. And they do a lot of the Chinese aircraft that no one else does. So with that, let's just talk a little bit about each. I'm going to try to keep it relatively brief and just kind of give a general idea. And just kind of let you see these models with the new camera now. So let's just get into it. The Shenyang J-8. Well, sort of. This is actually the J-8B. And this was obviously the second version. And this was China's first design, like I said. Showing you here the underside, probably take it off. These Air Force One stands are great, the metal. But boy, are they tall. So I'll probably take it off just for easier use here. This one especially is tall. So, this dates back to the 1960s. The Chinese government, the Chinese military, wanted a new high performance, high altitude, high speed interceptor to go against modern jet bombers. They kind of namely cited the B-58, but really any of them. And of course, experience in the Vietnam War. And they started off with the basic MiG-21 profile. Now, the Shenyang had been producing the MiG-21 as the J7, but it didn't have the performance, the range, the abilities that they wanted. Now, the first prototype J-8 did fly in '69, but because of political and cultural turmoil, it really didn't do anything for a decade. It wasn't until 1979 that work really picked back up and went forward. And by 1980, the original J8 was in service, but it had only visual range capabilities, so pretty short range guided missiles. And while originally it was capable of Mach 2.1, pretty fast by the standards of the 1960s, by the 80s, this is not exactly going to catch up with the highest end bombers. So in 82, they began work on the J8II project, and this resulted in 1984 in the J8B, as you see it here. I believe the Allies called the NATO codename was Finback, and it is a pretty impressive aircraft. It's about 70 feet long, has about a 31-foot wingspan. It's capable of reaching Mach 2.4. It has 7 hard points. It can carry beyond visual range missiles thanks to its radar. It can carry extra fuel tanks, and of course it can still carry short range missiles. It has a crew of 1. Originally, the J8 had 2 30mm cannon, but with the J8B, as it relied more on long-range missiles, this was reduced to 1 23mm cannon, which is plenty for a just-in-case type situation. And so finally, it entered into Chinese Army Air Force service and quickly replaced the original J8. They only would build about 80 of the original, and they would build about 300 of the B. And they did make a navalized version, the J8D. But in the late 90s, all work was canceled on further product improvements, including the J8C program, because of newer aircraft like the J10, we'll look at in a minute, and the J11, which will be in the second video. While it was not an outstanding aircraft, it was not a bad first effort. Not only did they use elements from the MiG-21 and the original J8, when they designed the B, they were able to get their hands on some MiG-23s, not directly from Russia, but actually thanks to Egypt. So some of the technology, especially with regards to the radar from the MiG-23, found its way into the J8B. And as far as I know, some of these are still in Army service, but they've been phasing them out since 2010 in favor of more modern aircraft. What else to say about it? Well, the model's quite cool. I got this from Pete's Collectibles. It was the last one he had in stock. It's all metal. Have a pilot in the canopy. Have a refueling probe up here. It has a couple of long-range, or at least medium-range missiles. And then it has fuel tanks. This one really doesn't have much articulation. There's not much to move on it. But the nice thing about these Air Force One models, they're pretty much all metal. The tail is all metal. The wings are all metal. The only polymer are like the missiles. Even the gear are metal. At least the struts, the wheels rotate. And again, it comes with this nice metal stand that has the name on it. And it's held together nicely by a screw here, a little thumb screw, so you can easily take it apart. Another thing I wish they did maybe was provide a couple of different stems so it could set either high or low, because I get why they have them angled up so you can see the ordnance. Pretty impressive looking, but man is it hard to get these on shelves. But the good thing is, because these stands are so heavy, they don't tip over. So for a relatively inexpensive 1/72 scale model, and that really no one else does J8s, it's really neat. I'm glad to have it. So with that, let's move on to its fighter bomber contemporary, the Xian JH-7, or as it was known by its export name, the FBC-1, Fighter Bomber China 1, and had a NATO reporting name of Flounder, because why not? And this is a beast. It's 73 feet long, has a wingspan of 42 feet, 2 engine, 2 crew, and yeah, like I said, this was designed as a fighter bomber, a ground attack. And this is one big, heavy model. Show you the underside here. And this dates back to the late 70s when the Chinese Army and the Chinese Navy needed a new ground attack fighter bomber because what they had was very obsolete. And so work began, and the project was authorized in the early 80s. Now originally they were going to do 2 versions, a side-by-side 2-seater for the Army and a tandem, so one in front of the other, for the Navy. But they decided to drop this and just go with the Navy version because it seemed like the Navy was more interested. So they produced several prototypes. They first flew in 1988, and the first dozen or so were delivered to the Navy for testing in the early 90s. And by the late 90s, they were ready to go. In the original JH7 would give way to the JH7A, which had a stronger yet lighter airframe and could carry more ordnance and had an additional hardpoint under the wings. For example, the original version could only carry 2 anti-shipping missiles. The later version could carry 4 plus other stores. Actually could carry up to 20,000 pounds. And it still could achieve Mach 1.5. And it had a double-barrel 23mm cannon for just in case. The J8 over there we just looked at really didn't have much in the way of ground attack. It could carry some rocket pods and it was about it. Well, this really didn't have much in the way of air-to-air. It could carry some missiles for defense, but its systems were built for ground attack. And originally for naval ground attack, but with later versions, as the Chinese Army was more interested, they improved its ground targeting capabilities for pinpoint accuracy. And the JH7A was quite popular. It would enter into Navy first, but then a short time later, the Army would get some, and was in widespread use by the 21st century. Now, this eventually would give way, about a decade later, to the further improved JH7B, which had updated avionics and still more weapons compatibilities. The aircraft would also get in-flight refueling at one point, and so on and so forth. And the Navy operates 120, and the Army Air Force operates 120. Total production, including everything, was 270, with production ending in 2017. But it's still very much in service today. It can carry unguided bombs, laser-guided bombs, satellite-guided bombs, anti-shipping missiles, rocket pods, additional fuel tanks, all kinds of fun stuff. and really isn't based on anything in particular. It's its own design. Very big. As to the model, it has the same metal stand with the name on it. It is quite heavy. It does have opening canopy. This one's a little stiff. I'm not going to force it. It also has moving flap in the back here. Now on this Air Force One, the wing is all metal, but the tail is polymer. And I think they did that so they could get it thin enough. Also, maybe just weight became a bit of a concern. And as you saw, it does come with a good bit of ordnance. That's always neat. Why not? One nice thing about the Air Force Ones too, the pitot tubes are metal. It always makes repairing them easier. It has the missiles for air defense on the wingtips. Yeah, this is definitely a beast. I think their name for it is Flying Leopard. But I don't know, Flounder's kind of more fun. So yeah, that's the fighter bomber. Let's get back to something more like a pure fighter. Also something smaller and easier to manage. The Chengdu J10. Chinese name is Vigorous Dragon, which I think is hilarious. I'm not sure of the NATO name. Some sources claim it's Firebird, others say no. But whatever it is a delta wing design. And so this is China kind of getting away from that Russian Soviet Komblak aesthetic. If anything, they're kind of more leaning into the Mirage or the Viggen, because we basically have a tailless delta wing with moving canards, which do move on this model. This model is of more of a flight demonstration scheme, but it's the only one I could find in 1/72 scale, so I rolled with it. In fact, these are running out of stock. And I did add some missiles to it to make it more interesting. This dates back to the late 80s when the Chinese government gave Chengdu the assignment to develop what was at first to be a modern, high-performance, highly maneuverable, lightweight fighter. Because the J-8 was rather big and heavy, this was to be more agile. So it really is kind of like the MiG-29, and it was meant to go up against that, the Su-27, the F-15, the F-16, the Mirage, things like that. So they began working on it, and the first prototype flew in 1998, and then the first deliveries to the Army Air Force for testing were in early 2003, and then the aircraft was adopted late that year, with deliveries soon coming in. And it really wasn't until 2007 the Chinese fully acknowledged this and shared some pictures and information. And this was to replace older aircraft. And because it was originally started in the Cold War, but very much went into service in the 21st century, this is why it evolved into a multi-role fighter. It is quite a bit smaller than the previous aircraft, or about 53 feet long, wingspan of 32 feet. It can get up to about Mach 2.2, It has the same max altitude as the J-8, about 60,000 feet. It carries one 23mm cannon, but it can also carry a wide range of air-to-air missiles, short, medium range, as well as guided air-to-surface weapons and unguided. And it can even carry reconnaissance pods and up to 3 external tanks to extend its range. It has a total of 11 hard points, although some of them aren't fully really usable. We have the 6 under the wings, we have a total of 3 under the fuselage, and we have a couple of these kind of chin hard points right up here, kind of like you see on the F-16. Of course, these have a little bit of a limitation. They're more for pods or maybe light, short-range missiles. Crew of 1. It's pretty aerobatic thanks to its delta design with moving canards. It actually benefited from some engine technology from Russia that China ended up with thanks to the whole J11 thing. That was kind of what was holding a lot of Chinese fighters back, was their jet engine technology. For example, they were using the WS-9. This was the first to try using the WS-10, although it took a little time to get it right. But by now, it is very much in service, and they started seeking export customers. They really wanted Argentina, for example, and they've courted others. And for export, they call this the F-10. And to date, they produced over 400. As far as I know, production is still officially ongoing. At least it can be. They did introduce an updated version known as the J10C back in 2018 that had avionics updates, cockpit updates, weapons compatibility updates. And so this is very much in Chinese service, even if it may not be their absolute mainstay. It's one of their aircraft. This is a neat model like all the rest. As you see, the canards move. They are metal. Even though it does not come with the ordnance, it at least has the spots for them so you can attach them. I put some from Hobby Master on. These are Chinese copies of Russian missiles. Has the standard stand. The canopy can open. We have the refueling probe, metal pitot tube, intakes here. Really a neat aircraft. Has the double wheel in the front. It's so small it doesn't roll, but the larger wheels in the back do roll. I thought about putting something on the chin stations, but I thought, don't want to go too overboard, so I put 2 medium-range missiles, 4 short-range, and a fuel tank. I thought that was good enough. I don't know, it's just a neat aircraft, but then again, I kind of like Delta wing designs. They're just very futuristic, even if by now they've been in service for a very long time. And so, yeah, this is really like their F-16. Modern, but not ultra-modern. And quite affordable and easy to operate. And with that, we'll get in to their truly modern aircraft. And if these two look kind of suspiciously similar to something you might know from the USA, well, you're not wrong. First, Chengdu had the Vigorous Dragon. And now we have Chengdu's Mighty Dragon. This is the J20. And it might resemble a certain aircraft to you. the American F-22 Raptor. And like that, this is designed to be an air superiority fighter. And it's considered a 5th generation stealth aircraft. And it dates back to the JX program when Chengdu and Shenyang competed. And that goes back to the 1990s. But this design was really furthered a lot in 2008. And then the government kind of set plans to have a prototype ready and flying by 2010-2011, which they achieved. The first prototype did taxi tests in 2010 and took to the skies in January of 2011. And then in 2014, it received quite a few updates to make it stealthier. And then in 2015, it entered into low rate production. And then towards the beginning of 2017, the first ones were given to the People's Army Air Force for testing. And then began training later that year, and the first squadron formed. And then in 2018, they began war games alongside other Chinese aircraft like the J10, the J11, the J16. And then by early 2019, the first operational squadron of 6 was ready to go and available. In August of that year, after a couple of years of testing, the government announced this would be the Army Air Force's next standard main air superiority fighter. So yeah, what do we have here? We're back to being big. It's about 67 feet long, has a wingspan of over 44 feet. It uses 2 engines. Standard version has a 1-seat cockpit, although a 2-seat version was announced last year, or at least rumored. Maximum speed is at least Mach 2, probably greater, and with the right engine it is capable of supercruise. And it has quite a great altitude of at least 66,000 feet. And it carries its payload in one center internal bay. And then it has 2 small side bays, much like the F-22. And again, like the F-22, it has 2 hard points on each wing for external stores, namely tanks. But these are not usually carried for combat because they would give away stealth quite a bit. The center bay can carry 6 missiles, either usually medium or long range air-to-air, although it can also carry guided air-to-surface ordnance, at least a limited amount. The 2 side are for short-range air-to-air missiles, and they're designed to open and close quickly as to not compromise stealth, and they're more for defending itself. It does have an aerial refueling probe that's retractable, and they did quite a bit in the front to make it stealthy, including the recessed intakes. They also put stealth coating onto the surfaces. However, it's not as stealthy as the Raptor. For one thing, these canards kind of taken from the company's earlier J10 are here. And in the back, the engine exhausts aren't as stealthy. They're more just open. Still yet, from the front, it's quite stealthy. It just gives it away a bit from the rear. Now this model is interesting. It has the all moving tail planes here. They can rotate. And again, the canards can move. The canopy opens, but the gear are down and the bays are permanently open. And actually last year, after this was announced as being next standard, it went from low rate production, began in 2015, into standard full rate production 2019. And then in 2020, just this summer, they announced a new version, the J20B. And this seems to have thrust vectoring engines, which were first trialed out with the WS-10C engine on the company's previous J10 again. It's also speculated that they might have the WS-15 engine finally have its bugs worked out, and if so, this means it's now Super Cruise capable. As of this time last year, at least 50 had been delivered to the Chinese Air Force, and upwards of 20 are now operational, and chances are these numbers are greater. But again, a lot is not known about this aircraft because it is their cutting edge. As far as the model, I actually imported this from China right before all the COVID stuff hit. And it came in. I've been looking for a 172 scale J20. And of course, after I took quite a bit of trouble to finally track one down, then Air Force One re-released the model this year. But the good news is I actually paid less for one of the older ones than what the new ones sell for. And I got it a few months earlier than I would have. So no complaints. And the newer ones still only have gear down and the bays open. It is neat. It's like the F-22 Raptor, but then it has a few things like the canards that are different. The Chinese were accused of breaching American security about a decade ago, and so maybe some elements from various projects were used in this. Of course, they deny this. And much has been made of it, but we still really just don't know because it's just now coming into operational service. But you can't take the fact away that it is a very cutting-edge jet, and the Chinese did beat the Russians. They have their Sukhoi Su-57, but this came online first and has definitely gone into full rate production first. Now that said, China is now operating aircraft carriers. And this is not a good aircraft carrier aircraft. For one thing, it only has one front landing gear. But for another, it's a little too big and heavy. And just generally more suited for ground operations. So with that, let's talk about our final aircraft today. Not to be forgotten, Shenyang's plane of many names. Originally kind of called the F-60, at least informally. J31 seems to be the standard, although newer versions are sometimes referred to as J35, or FC31, or FC35. And this dates back to, the same kind of project from the 90s, but then when the J20 pretty much got the official go-ahead around 2008, 2009, Shenyang kind of kept on their project is an internal company private thing, at least as private as anything can be in China. And they too benefited from perhaps the Chinese data breach, which is why this resembles, at least in good part, the F-35 Lightning II. It was a little behind the J20. The first prototype wasn't ready till mid-2012 and flew for the first time in October of that year. And then in 2014, they started kind of revealing it. They also made some efforts to improve stealth and stability and payload and everything. And then by 2015, they were ready to start marketing it. And they were looking for foreign investors, foreign customers. This was meant to be an export, since at this time the Chinese military did not seem that interested. And by 2016, they had further refined the design. They went to slightly newer stabilizers, better stealth abilities, more interoperability with newer ordnance, and continued on with demonstrating it in various shows and whatnot. And then in 2018, both the Chinese People's Army Air Force and Naval Air Force started to get interested again, and there started to be some government funding towards it. So now it looks like it might be back in the running. Now to this point, they've only made a handful of prototypes, included an updated version known as, to some, the J35. So what do we have here? Well, it is a smaller aircraft than the J20. It's about 55 feet long, got a wingspan a little under 38 feet. It's a little slower, it's about Mach 1.8, and has a maximum altitude of about 60,000 feet at a rough estimate. It is stealthy, but not as stealthy as many others. Still uses 2 engines. It has an internal weapons bay that's split with 2 sections. Plus it has 6 hardpoints, 3 under each wing. And whereas the J20 is meant to be a multi-role air superiority fighter, this is really a strictly multi-role fighter. It has more compatibility with air-to-surface munitions, guided or otherwise, much like the F-35. And it can carry up to about 18,000 pounds, about 4,400 pounds in the internal bay, and over 13,000 pounds on the external hardpoints. This is still a lighter payload than the J20, but not by a whole lot. And it maybe can take a little more flexibility. So why did the Chinese Air Force go with the J20? They felt it to be more advanced, stealthier. They also pointed out that it had longer range and better overall performance. They just felt it was a more future-proof aircraft. But proponents of the J20, the J31, pointed out the fact that it was lighter, more maneuverable, a little more flexible, and frankly cheaper to purchase and operate. So a little less advanced, but there are some benefits to that. And Shenyang has been marketing this to nations around the world who can't afford or aren't politically able to buy the F-35 as, well, a Chinese knockoff alternative. And though the earlier versions might have had some problems, the newer versions are quite capable. And actually, it seems like the Navy might be this aircraft's major customer within China, because it kind of addresses the issues the J-20 would have flying off a carrier. It has a 2-wheeled front gear. It is considerably smaller and lighter, good for carriers. It still has 2 engines, which is always good for an aircraft operating over water. And it can carry external fuel tanks and a wide range of weapons. So it looks like this might be the Chinese Navy's next fighter, replacing the J-15. It's even been rumored that this was approved for full rate production just this month, December of 2020. But we'll see. And just as the J20 had a new version shown off this past summer, Shenyang, not to be left behind, showed off a improved version of the J31. So we'll have to just see. Both might go into service. This might be more Navy, the J20 more Army, Air Force, or not. And they might have success with export customers, or maybe it's just hopeful. Just wishing. Time will tell. It is so very an F-35. Neat model. I originally picked this one up when I couldn't find a J20. I thought, well, it's a modern Chinese jet. And I wasn't disappointed. It has the rolling gear. Again, it's all metal, including the tail. Not really much moving parts on this. Canopy does open. And the wheels roll, including the small front wheel. But that's about it. And it does come with the external stores under the wings, which is always neat. And there we have pretty much the current status of Chinese military aircraft as of the end of 2020. And let's line them up all one more time for the end. You can really see some commonalities between the J8 and the JH7. The 7's obviously much bigger, but the way the intakes are done, the overall wings, 2 engines, the tail, just a common, very much a Soviet look, even if it's not Russian. But then we get to the J10, and we can see getting into the modern era and just going in a different direction here. It's a neat little aircraft, I still think. And even though the J20 is significantly advanced from the J10, you can definitely tell that there's a common manufacturer, common design here. They definitely resemble each other in a lot of ways. And then I still think the J31 is basically an F-35. I know there are differences, but it so much looks like one, and I really like a lot of other previous Chinese aircraft. As far as the models, again, they're very neat. Not much to articulate on this one. It does have the big air-to-air missiles. And then for the JH, we have the moving tail rudder. We also have moving horizontals here. And it has these big, what I presume to be anti-ship missiles underneath. And pods. It's very loaded out. And even though the J10 is more of a flight demonstrator, I don't mind it because you just don't find these And when these Air Force One Chinese aircraft dry up, they get very difficult to find. And like I said, the J20, I put a lot of effort into getting one. The new ones I'm sure are good. The other thing about this one, it's a little loose. The canards are. As are, I'm going to keep knocking that. Luckily it's sturdy. As are the tails. It's not a big deal. And if I wanted to kind of stick them in place, I could always put a tiny blob of blue tack in there. Wouldn't want to glue it, just because it's nice to have the movement. But I can tack it if I need to. And these are tied together at least. And finally with this one, not a lot of articulation here again, because there's just not much to move on this aircraft. But it really completes the lineup. And you never know, this might be their next naval carrier aircraft. Anyway, in the next part of this, the second half, we'll look at kind of Chinese license built or sometimes not license built versions of Russian planes like the J5, J7, J11, J15, J16, and maybe a couple of others as a little surprise. So of these, which one is your favorite? Let me know in the comments. As always, if you could, like, share, and subscribe. I greatly appreciate you tuning in. I'm now very tired, so I will catch you very soon next time.